London, 1850. The fog does not merely settle upon the city, it clings to it like a damp woolen shroud. It drifts through the narrow arteries of the East End, swallowing the gaslight and muffling the desperate cacophony of the working poor. If you were a man or woman walking home from the docks after a 12-hour shift, your stomach would be hollow, an aching, empty cavern, and then you would smell it, that rich, savoury, slightly greasy aroma wafting from a steaming metal basket carried by a street vendor. A penny. That was the price of admission to the most democratic meal in the Victorian Empire, a hot meat pie. It felt solid, heavy in the hand, a promise of warmth in a city that rarely offered any. You did not ask where the meat came from. To ask would be to court hunger, and in the shadow of the great industrial machine, hunger was the one neighbour you could never afford to invite in. But have you ever wondered about the arithmetic of that penny? How could a shopkeeper possibly source, butcher, bake, and transport a meat-filled pastry for a single copper coin while still making a profit? The answer lies not in the bakeries, but in the dark, subterranean world beneath the city's floorboards, the midnight deliveries of condemned livestock, the hidden basement kitchens where light rarely touched the ingredients, and the quiet, desperate trade of things that were never intended to be consumed. We are not here to judge the starving, nor to demonize the desperate. We are here to uncover the urban machinery of the Victorian era. We are about to pull back the crust of that iconic penny pie to see the city as it truly was, a place where the gap between wealth and poverty was bridged by ingredients that thrived in the shadows. Join me as we walk through the fog, away from the glittering storefronts of the aristocracy, and into the labyrinth of Smithfield, where the true cost of a meal was measured in secrets. The channel Sleepy History with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. To understand the mystery of the penny pie, one must first understand the epicenter of its birth, Smithfield Market. By the mid-19th century, Smithfield was not merely a market, it was a living, breathing, and often frantic organism at the heart of London. It was the place where the pastoral met the industrial, where the rural innocence of the countryside was unceremoniously crushed under the iron wheels of urban demand. Imagine the sensory overload, tens of thousands of animals, sheep, cattle and pigs herded through the narrow cobbled streets of London, forcing their way toward the slaughterhouses. The air here was thick with the scent of damp wool manure and the sharp metallic tang of fear. It was a chaotic theatre of commerce, where livestock were driven until they were exhausted, battered by the journey, and often arriving at their destination in states that would shock a modern observer. This was the supply chain for the masses in an era before effective refrigeration. Speed was the only currency that mattered, but speed came at a price. Animals that fell ill during the long forced marches, or those that died before reaching the butcher's block, did not simply disappear. In a city driven by the relentless grinding pressure of industrial output, nothing was truly wasted. The dead meat trade, as it was quietly referred to, began right here in the alleys surrounding the market. It was an ugly urban arithmetic. A cow that died of exhaustion a mile outside the city gates was still a cow. It had flesh, it had bones, and most importantly, it had a market value if handled with enough discretion. Beneath the surface of London's daily commerce there existed a silent agreement. As long as the meat was seasoned, boiled, and encased in a thick golden-brown crust, the origins of that meat became a matter of indifference to the hungry masses. This system didn't just happen by accident, it was a necessity of the time. The infrastructure of the city was straining under the weight of its own population growth, and the demand for cheap, quick, high-calorie food was insatiable. But as we peer closer at the bustling activity of Smithfield, we begin to see the first cracks in the facade, the whispered transactions, the unmarked carts arriving in the dead of night, and the men whose business was to ensure that the supply never stopped, regardless of the quality. This was the shadow economy that made the penny pie possible. and it was far more complex than any simple street snack should ever have been. If Smithfield was the heart of the beast, the basement kitchens of London were its stomach, and it was here that the true transformation occurred. Picture a subterranean space, low-ceilinged and damp, where the only light came from the flickering, soot-stained glow of coal ovens. Here, the temperature was a constant oppressive heat, mingled with the thick, cloying smell of boiling suet and stale tallow. This was where the meat of unknown origin met the filling of the penny pie. The process was a masterclass in deception, refined by necessity. The meat, often arriving in a state that would make a modern health inspector weep, required vigorous treatment before it could be rendered palatable. It was chopped not neatly, but brutally into small uniform pieces, effectively erasing any anatomical features that might reveal the animal's identity or the cause of its demise. This was the first layer of the secret. By reducing everything to a common texture, the bakers turned uncertainty into a commodity. But texture was only half the battle. Flavour was the greater hurdle. In the dim, claustrophobic atmosphere of these kitchens, spices were used with a heavy hand. Pepper, mace, and secret aromatic blends were applied, not just to enhance the flavour, but to mask the sourness of aging flesh. The gravy was the true unsung hero or villain of this process. It was a thick, gelatinous brew, boiled down from bones and trimmings until it was little more than a concentrated vessel for salt and seasoning. It acted as a glue, binding the disparate bits of filler together into a cohesive, savoury mass that could slide easily down the throat. And then there was the bulk. The art of the penny pie relied on stretching the meat as far as it could go. Stale bread, vegetable scraps, and even flour-based pastes were added to the mix, effectively watering down the animal protein until a tiny portion of meat could serve a dozen pies. It was a calculated, cold-blooded efficiency. The bakers knew that their customers were not looking for prime cuts. They were looking for calories, for warmth, and for the feeling of being full. They were feeding the hunger of a city that had little time for reflection. As you moved from one station to the next in these cramped, sweating chambers, you would notice the rhythm of the work. It was hypnotic, repetitive, and entirely detached from the final destination of the product. The men and women working here were not bakers in the traditional sense. They were processors of human survival. They understood the grim reality of the city, and they operated within the boundaries of what was permitted by necessity, leaving the question of ethics to those who were fortunate enough to have a full pantry. The machinery was running smoothly, but beneath the surface, the ingredients were growing more questionable by the hour. Beyond the questionable meat and the heavy seasoning, there existed a silent, chemical manipulation of the penny pie that truly marked the industrial age's intervention in the human diet. As the city grew, so did the demand for products that looked fresh even when they were anything but. In the parlours of the wealthy, chemistry was a science. In the bakeries of the poor, it was a toolkit for survival and deception. Consider the colour of the gravy and the crust. A sickly pale pie would never sell. The human eye is the first judge of a meal, and the bakers knew this instinctively. To achieve that rich golden appetizing hue, substances of dubious origin were introduced to the dough and the filling. Some used mixtures of alum or mineral-based dyes to give a veneer of healthiness to ingredients that had lost their vibrancy days before. It was an era before rigorous food standards, a time when the label meat was an umbrella term broad enough to cover almost anything that had once walked on four legs, or perhaps in some darker urban legends, things that hadn't. But the most insidious ingredient was not necessarily the meat itself. It was the filler that bridged the gap between the seller's poverty and the buyer's starvation. Stale bread, often sourced from the leavings of wealthier houses, was soaked, broken down, and folded into the meat mixture. It wasn't just about cutting costs, it was about the psychology of the meal. A pie filled only with meat would be too expensive to sell for a penny. A pie filled with nothing but dough would be rejected by a customer who needed the sustenance of protein. The filler was the perfect medium, a way to balance the ledger while maintaining the illusion of a hearty, nourishing meal. This was the ugly urban arithmetic at play. The baker calculated the price of ingredients against the purchasing power of the average labourer, and then adjusted the chemistry to match. If the meat was particularly tainted, more spices were added. If the supply of flour was low, more vegetable waste was utilised. It was a fluid, ever-changing formula, designed to keep the margins thin but the volume high. The customers, driven by the biting cold and the long, exhausting hours of factory work, did not have the luxury of chemistry. They had the luxury of a hot, savoury treat, and they accepted the trade-off. In the sprawling, soot-choked landscape of 19th-century London, the line between a meal and a health hazard was drawn by the depth of one's pockets. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Benedict, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes and inspired by real events, figures, and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events. The most haunting aspect of the penny pie was not the secret ingredients themselves, but the collective silence that surrounded them. There was a fragile, unspoken contract between the baker and the street corner labourer. It was a social performance of denial. Both parties knew, at some deep, intuitive level, that the math of the penny pie simply did not add up. They knew that a pound of prime beef cost significantly more than a single copper coin. Yet they chose to look at the steaming pastry, feel its warmth against their freezing palms, and suspend their disbelief. This was the strange reality of the Victorian urban experience. To live in London was to navigate a dense web of appearances in the drawing rooms of the elite. The conversation centred on the refinement of the palate and the purity of imported tea. But in the gaslit streets, the conversation was muted, focused on the immediate, visceral need to quiet the ache of hunger. Curiosity was a luxury for those with full bellies. For the hungry it was a danger, a threat to the only source of comfort available in a harsh industrial world. If you're finding yourself captivated by these glimpses into the hidden gears of history, the stories that aren't often told in the school books, I invite you to become a part of our journey. If you enjoy uncovering these quiet, historical secrets and find peace in exploring the past through this storytelling lens, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Your support helps us continue to weave these narratives and keeps the lamps of history burning bright in our collective imagination. We are building a community that values the depth of human experience, one story at a time. This silence, however, was not permanent. As the city grew more crowded and the pressures of poverty intensified, the cracks in the facade began to widen. Whispers started to move through the tenements. There were rumours of what really went into the barrels delivered to the cellars at midnight. The newspapers of the time, in their own veiled, cautious language, began to hint at the unwholesome practices of the trade. But even as these whispers grew into a low roar, the consumption continued. The demand for the penny pie remained, because the machine that fed it was far more powerful than any individual's conscience. We are now standing on the precipice of a shift, a moment when the curtain is about to be pulled back further than ever before, revealing the true scale of the Victorian urban appetite. We must remember that the Victorian appetite was forged in a climate that was at times exceptionally unforgiving. While the Industrial Revolution roared, the legacy of the Little Ice Age still lingered, chilling the European landscape in ways that made agriculture a constant battle against the elements. Crop failures were not just statistics, they were felt in the hollows of the belly of every Londoner. When the harvest was poor, the price of grain skyrocketed, and the cost of quality livestock became prohibitive for the common worker. This environmental pressure acted as a silent, invisible hand pushing the city toward the penny pie. If you were a labourer in a textile mill, shivering in the damp chill that seeped through the factory walls, you were living in a world where warmth was not just a sensation, it was a requirement for survival. The penny pie, regardless of its questionable interior, provided the caloric density needed to sustain that labour. It was a utilitarian invention, a byproduct of a society that had pushed itself to the edge of what its land could provide. Yet this environmental scarcity served only to deepen the shadows where the meat trade flourished. When fresh, healthy animals were scarce, the incentive to utilize every part of an animal became even greater. The concept of waste was a luxury the city could no longer afford. Every scrap of gristle, every bit of connective tissue, and every organ that the affluent would dismiss with a wave of a scented handkerchief was reclaimed, processed, and tucked away into a pastry crust. As we wander through this history, we begin to see that the penny pie was, in its own grim way, an artifact of its time. It was a reflection of a city that had grown too fast, fed by a rural landscape that was struggling to keep pace, all under the grey, weeping skies of an era defined by its industrial grit. The people who made these pies were not merely villains in an apron, they were operators within a system that demanded efficiency at the cost of clarity. They were the ones who navigated the intersection of extreme poverty and the relentless mechanical hunger of the urban workforce. The question remains, as the city continued to expand, where did the boundary lie between the food that sustained life and the food that merely delayed the inevitable? To truly grasp the scale of this phenomenon, we must step away from the bustling marketplaces and find ourselves in the dense, labyrinthine residential districts, the rookeries. These were the neighbourhoods where the penny pie was most revered and where its presence was as consistent as the morning fog. Imagine walking through one of these streets. The houses lean toward each other, their upper stories almost touching, effectively blocking out any hope of direct sunlight. The ground is a patchwork of uneven stones, perpetually slick with a mixture of mud, soot, and the runoff from the gutter. This was a world of intense proximity, where privacy was non-existent and the smells of life were shared by all. In such an environment, the arrival of the hot pie vendor was an event. It wasn't just about food, it was about a momentary pause in the relentless cycle of labour. When the vendor appeared, shouting his wares, there was a visible shift in the mood of the street. Conversations would pause, shoulders would drop, and for a few precious minutes, the existential weight of the workday would be lifted by the scent of warm pastry. This was the social utility of the penny pie. It was the great equalizer of the slum, a communal comfort that required no formal dining room, no silverware, and no polite conversation. It was a simple, handheld redemption. But even in the midst of this relief, there was an undercurrent of folklore. Everyone had a story. You would hear the whispers in the queue, stories of barrels delivered to the cellar in the dead of night, of strange muffled noises from the bakeries, or of unidentified animal carcasses being wheeled through the back alleys behind the cover of darkness. These were the urban legends of Victorian London, tales that served as a form of dark entertainment, a way to process the uncomfortable reality of what they were consuming. Was it beef? Was it horse? Was it something even less recognizable? The debates were frequent, yet they were rarely resolved. Why was there no investigation? Why didn't the people revolt? The answer is as complex as the city itself. To challenge the supply chain was to challenge the very structure of their survival. If the penny pie was exposed as a fraud, then what would replace it? There were no alternatives that were both affordable and warm. The hunger of the city was a beast that could not be reasoned with, only fed. And so the skepticism was relegated to the realm of gossip, a whispered secret that added a thrill of danger to every bite. People didn't stop eating, they simply learned to eat with a sense of fatalism. They accepted that the price of their daily bread, or in this case their daily pie, was a suspension of the truth. This fatalism permeated the Victorian mindset. It was an era where the divide between the classes was absolute, yet they were all interconnected by the same supply chains, the same city infrastructure, and the same reliance on the industrial machine. The wealthy might have enjoyed their roast beef in the quiet comfort of a private dining room, but they too relied on the labour and the logistics that were perfected in the shadow of the penny pie trade. The city was a vast, interconnected organism, and the pie was one of its most essential, if unacknowledged, building blocks. As we look deeper into the architecture of these kitchens, we find that the secret ingredients were not just physical, they were in many ways a reflection of the systemic compromises that defined the entire century. The story of the pie is not merely a story about food, it is a story about the hidden costs of progress and the silent endurance of a population that was never truly meant to thrive, but only to persist. While the working poor huddled in their tenements, chewing on the mystery of their penny pies, the elite of Victorian London lived in a parallel dimension of culinary excess. In the kitchens of Mayfair, the concern was for the perfect clarity of a consommé or the precise temperature of a game roast. But even these two worlds, the stark, desperate basement kitchens and the opulent, tiled culinary cathedrals of the rich, were closer than they seemed. They were both parts of the same insatiable urban machine. The very trimmings, the lesser cuts that were rejected by the grand chefs because they lacked the necessary prestige for a high society dinner, were the exact ingredients that found their way into the barrels destined for the street corner bakeries. Nothing in London was truly discarded, it was merely reallocated through a complex, silent social hierarchy. The artistry of the penny pie was, in essence, a masterpiece of disguise. If you were to walk into one of those basement kitchens, you wouldn't see chaos, you would see a highly specialized, if brutal, assembly line. The primary goal was to strip the meat of its identity. By chopping it into microscopic pieces and subjecting it to hours of high-heat boiling, the artisans of the pie rendered it into a uniform, neutral slurry. They used the power of the gravy to unify the mixture, creating a singular savoury identity that masked the diverse and often questionable origins of the contents. It was a form of culinary alchemy, turning the unwanted into the essential. This required a deep practical knowledge of seasonings. A heavy infusion of pepper, salt, and various herbs was not just for taste, it was a preservative, an antiseptic for the palate, and a mask for the first signs of decay. This is the point in our journey where I invite you to pause and reflect. History is rarely as clean or as linear as the books suggest. It is often messy, interconnected, and built on the backs of quiet compromises. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden machinery of Victorian life, please take a moment to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Does the idea of a democratic but questionable meal change how you view the progress of the 19th century? Your engagement helps us continue to produce these long-form, immersive historical documentaries. Your questions and your curiosity are what drive the narrative forward, and I'm always grateful to see how this story resonates with you. As we continue to dissect this, consider the psychological toll on those who prepared these pies day after day. They were the invisible conduits of the city, working in sweltering conditions to produce the fuel that kept London moving. They were not necessarily malicious, they were the cogs that allowed the clockwork of Victorian society to tick forward. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the city was a place where information was controlled and where the most profitable secret was the one that fed 1,000 people for a single penny. The architecture of these kitchens was designed to keep the secret hidden, to keep the steam rising, and to keep the cycle of demand and supply from ever slowing down. There was an ugly, fascinating efficiency to it all, a dark logic that governed the streets and sustained the empire, one crust-covered secret at a time. The chemical reality of the Victorian street pie is a subject that rarely finds its way into the grand narratives of the era, yet it was arguably one of the most critical factors in the city's ability to function. In the absence of modern refrigeration, the baker's primary adversary was not the scarcity of ingredients, but the relentless, accelerating speed of decomposition. A piece of meat left in a damp, coal smoke-filled London basement was a ticking clock. Within hours, the proteins would begin to break down, the juices would sour, and the surface would become a playground for microbes. To combat this, the bakers developed a sophisticated, if grim, understanding of preservation through manipulation. The most common technique was, of course, the heavy use of salt. It was the ubiquitous seasoning of the poor, a way to draw the moisture out of the meat, effectively halting the fermentation process for just long enough to get it into the oven. But salt alone was often insufficient. This is where the darker side of Victorian food science emerged. There were accounts of bakers using mineral additives such as alum, a substance more commonly found in tanning or paper manufacturing, to stiffen the texture of the flour and keep the pie crusts from disintegrating when they were packed with the heavy liquid-laden fillings. Imagine the sensory experience of standing in one of these kitchens. It was not merely the heat, it was the sharp, biting scent of brine and chemical preservatives struggling against the inevitable. There was a peculiar, almost acrid quality to the air. The bakers would often use excessive amounts of black pepper, mace and cloves, spices that were relatively cheap in bulk but potent in flavour, to overwhelm the senses. If you were a hungry labourer, your olfactory nerves would be so aggressively assaulted by the smell of boiling fat and pungent spice that any subtle underlying notes of decay would be effectively neutralised. It was a sensory diversion, a clever way to keep the customer focused on the heat and the salt rather than the true age of the protein. This was not merely cooking, it was a form of industrial damage control. The bakers were not aiming for a balanced flavour profile, they were aiming for a product that could survive the journey from the cellar to the street corner without visibly failing. This explains the characteristic greasiness of the penny pie. The fat served as an insulator, creating a seal around the meat that protected it from the air and kept the moisture locked in. It was a masterclass in low-level engineering. By focusing on the structural integrity of the pie, the bakers created a product that was paradoxically resilient, even if its component parts were teetering on the edge of shelf-life failure. As we unravel these layers, we see that the Victorian penny pie was, in every sense, a triumph of necessity over quality. It was a product that embodied the era's frantic pace, a time when cities were outgrowing their own ability to sustain themselves, and when the average person was forced to prioritise simple caloric intake over any pretense of freshness. The reliance on these heavy-handed techniques created a generation of Londoners with a highly specific, perhaps dulled palate. They expected their meat to be intensely seasoned, to be firm, and to be piping hot. They had been conditioned by the city's limitations to accept a version of meat that had been fundamentally altered by the demands of the urban environment. This, in turn, fueled the cycle of the penny pie industry, making it an essential, if deeply misunderstood, feature of the London landscape. The chemistry of survival was a delicate dance, performed in the dark, and it kept the city breathing even when the ingredients themselves were holding their own secrets. The machinery of the penny pie did not end at the bakery door. It extended into the very veins of the city streets. The distribution network was as clandestine as the production process itself. Throughout the grey, rain-slicked morning, a fleet of rickety, hand-pushed carts and repurposed horse-drawn carriages would emerge from the fog. These were the mobile storefronts of the pie trade. They were not registered, they were not regulated, and they were in many ways the most vital link in the chain of urban sustenance. Think of the men who operated these carts. They were the frontline salesmen of the penny pie, individuals who knew the rhythm of the factories and the exact timing of the dock workers' shifts. They possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of the city's geography. They knew which corners were sheltered from the wind, which alleys provided the best cover, and which factories were home to the most desperate, hungry crowds. They were part of the landscape, shadowy figures clad in worn, greased aprons, calling out their prices in voices rasped by years of inhaling coal smoke and damp air. Their carts were marvels of makeshift engineering, designed to keep the pies hot in the biting London chill, often using charcoal burners tucked into hidden compartments beneath the display racks. As you listen to this, you might find yourself questioning the resilience of the people who relied on these carts. It is a story of profound endurance, a testament to the fact that even in the most challenging conditions, human beings find ways to adapt, to survive, and to sustain one another. If you have been finding these revelations about the hidden machinery of history thought-provoking, And if you would like to continue this journey through the shadowed streets of the past with us, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon. Your support allows us to keep digging deeper into these archives, to keep narrating the stories that history books often leave aside. What other secret industries of the 19th century do you think deserve to be uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your curiosity is the map we use to navigate these forgotten narratives. The circulation of these carts was relentless. As one cart would run empty, another would be replenished from a secret depot, ensuring that the supply never lagged behind the demand. It was a perfectly functioning, albeit dark, market system. The competition was fierce, not based on quality, but on speed and availability. The most successful vendors were the ones who could reach the highest concentrations of hungry labourers at the exact moment they were most susceptible to the smell of warm pastry. This again illustrates the efficiency of the Victorian urban machine. It was a system that maximised caloric intake with minimal cost, a system that prioritised function over form and survival over sustenance. As these carts wove through the narrow, crowded streets of the city, they were not just transporting food, they were transporting the lifeblood of the industrial age. They carried the secret, greasy, pepper-laden fuel that kept the factories turning and the city alive, one penny at a time. By the later decades of the century, the absolute silence that had once protected the penny pie trade began to fracture. The emergence of investigative journalism and a growing public consciousness regarding sanitation meant that the secret ingredients were no longer entirely unknown. Sensationalist headlines in broadsheets would occasionally hint at the horrors of the dead meat trade, using vivid, unsettling language to describe the conditions in the hidden basement kitchens. These reports were the first ripples of a wave that would eventually lead to the implementation of the first tentative food safety regulations. Yet curiously, the consumption of the penny pie did not cease. There is a profound sociological lesson in this. When a population's survival is tied to a specific system, no matter how flawed or unhygienic that system may be, the truth is often treated as a secondary concern. The labourers did not read the sensationalist broadsheets with the intention of boycotting their local pie vendor. They read them with a sense of morbid curiosity, perhaps a shudder of disgust, and then they returned to the street corner because the hunger remained. The necessity of the penny pie had transcended the truth. It had become a cornerstone of the working-class diet, an institution that was as much about the social rhythm of the day as it was about the caloric content of the meal. This era was a fascinating study in the psychology of denial. The city was changing, and with it, the expectations of the populace, but the infrastructure of poverty was remarkably static. Even as the authorities began to inspect the markets more closely, the subterranean trade simply shifted, becoming more adept at concealment. The ugly urban arithmetic simply adjusted its variables to account for the risk of discovery. It was a cat-and-mouse game played on a massive societal scale. As we delve into these historical complexities, it's vital to remember that these transformations were not overnight. They were a slow, grinding evolution, defined by the tension between the push for a cleaner, modern city and the inertia of a population that was still struggling to find enough to eat. This persistent demand for the penny pie also speaks to the resilience, or perhaps the desperation, of the human spirit. In a city where everything was being measured, optimized and commodified, the pie remained one of the few things that felt accessible. It was a tangible piece of comfort in a world that was becoming increasingly cold and industrialized. As we continue to look back, we find that the sickening secrets were, in a way, the price paid for the city's meteoric rise. London was building an empire, and the labour that powered that expansion had to be fed by any means necessary. The story of the pie is the story of that era's hidden foundation, a foundation built on secrets, seasoning, and a silent collective agreement to keep the hunger at bay. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. The inevitability of change began to cast a long, cooling shadow over the basement kitchens. As the Victorian era matured into its final, most rigid stages, the state's gaze finally turned toward the alleyways. The early tentative legislation, the first tentative steps toward the regulation of food purity, started to impose a new set of rules on the marketplace. For the masters of the penny pie, this was not merely a matter of improved hygiene, it was an existential threat. The very arithmetic that had made their business model so successful, the secret sourcing, the subterranean processing, the reliance on the unknown, was now for the first time a potential liability. Those who navigated this transition were the ones who understood that the future of the pie trade lay in the veneer of legitimacy. It was no longer enough to operate in the dark, one had to perform the role of a reputable businessman. Some of the more established pie sellers began to move their operations from the damp basements into slightly more accessible street-level shops. They replaced the mystery of the barrels with the appearance of storefront transparency, even if the ingredients themselves remained largely unchanged. They learned the language of the authorities, adopting the vocabulary of quality and wholesomeness, while simultaneously mastering the art of the modern supply chain. It was a fascinating transformation. The ugly urban arithmetic did not disappear, it simply became more professional. The sheer brazen uncertainty of the earlier years was polished over with a layer of commercial respectability. The pie remained cheap, it remained filling, and it remained essential to the industrial labourer, but the mechanisms of its production were no longer the wild, unchecked frontier they had once been. The inspectors, with their clipboards and their newfound mandates, were now walking the same streets where the carts had once moved in secrecy, and yet the core of the experience remained hauntingly similar. Consider the labourer, standing in the cold, still waiting for his warm pie. Does he care about the new regulations? Does he care about the purity of the flour or the source of the protein? For him, the reality of the street has not changed. The wind still bites, the hours are still long, and the hunger still requires an immediate, affordable response. The social contract of the penny pie was built on a foundation of human necessity that predated the laws and in many ways superseded them. Even as the state began to draw lines around what was permitted, the shadow economy adapted, finding new ways to satisfy the bottomless hunger of the city. The story of the pie reveals a truth about the Victorian urban experience that is often overlooked, that the city was not just a place of industry and progress, but a place of constant silent negotiation between the needs of the individual and the structures of the system. As we look back at the twilight of the 19th century, we find that the legacy of the penny pie is far more complex than a mere historical curiosity. It stands as a powerful monument to the grit of a generation that lived through the most rapid period of urban expansion in human history. The penny pie was, in its own paradoxical way, an engine of the Industrial Revolution. Without this cheap, accessible fuel, the workforce that built the railroads, the bridges, and the global trade networks might not have had the physical stamina to endure the grueling labour that the century demanded. It was a compromise, a dark bargain struck between the hunger of the populace and the demands of an empire. The transition from the wild, unregulated era of the mid-century to the more organised structures of the Edwardian period was not just a change in laws, it was a shift in the human perspective. We began to demand for the first time to know what was in our food. We began to understand that the health of the individual was inextricably linked to the purity of the supply chain. This shift, however, was born from the very horrors of the penny pie era. The stories of the condemned meat, the chemical additives, and the subterranean kitchens were the catalysts that forced a change. We are the beneficiaries of that history, living in a world where the provenance of our meal is, at least in theory, a fundamental right. Yet there is a haunting quality to the memory of the Victorian street pie. It reminds us of a time when the gap between the haves and the have-nots was so vast that it created two entirely different worlds within the same city. The elite dined in a world of curated elegance, while the poor navigated a world of profound, sometimes dangerous uncertainty. The pie was the bridge between these two worlds, a humble, greasy, soot-covered bridge that kept the city from fracturing entirely. It was a symbol of the resilience of the working poor, who managed to find a moment of warmth and sustenance in a reality that often offered them little else. We must also consider the cost of this progress. As we moved toward the standardized, regulated world of the 20th century, we lost something of that visceral, unfiltered connection to our food. The urban experience became more mediated, more sanitized, and in many ways more detached. The penny pie was a product of a raw, unvarnished reality, a time when life and death were closer, and when the act of eating was a more immediate, elemental struggle. As we move forward, we should perhaps remember these shadowed corners of history, not with judgment, but with a degree of empathy for those who lived, worked, and survived within them. They were the architects of our modern world, and they paid a price, one penny at a time, that we are only now beginning to fully understand. When we strip away the grit and the soot of 19th-century London, we are left with a fundamental question about the human condition. What are we willing to ignore in the name of survival? The penny pie was not just a meal, it was an exercise in collective cognitive dissonance. It required an entire city to agree that if they did not ask too many questions, the warmth in their hands would be real, the taste would be savoury, and the hunger would be suppressed, if only for an hour. It is a terrifying thought, yet it is a deeply human one. In our own time, we also make these silent agreements. We look away from the complexities of global supply chains. We accept the convenience of modern life without peering too closely into the mechanisms that sustain it, and we prioritize the immediate benefit over the deeper, often uncomfortable truth. The Victorian era, with its towering chimneys, its endless rows of terraced housing, and its frantic steam-powered pace, was the prototype for our own world. The penny pie was its most intimate, most visceral artifact. It was the point where the macroeconomic forces of the Industrial Revolution intersected with the microeconomic realities of a labourer's pocket. It was a tangible piece of history that, if analysed, reveals the entire structural integrity of that society. When we study the ingredients, the condemned meat, the bulked-out flour, the chemically sharpened flavour, we are not just studying a snack. We are studying the way a civilization organized itself, the way it valued, or failed to value, the lives of its urban poor, and the way it constructed a facade of progress while relying on a basement-level machinery of deception. Perhaps this is why these stories remain so compelling. They offer us a mirror. When we hear about the dark, cramped kitchens of Smithfield, we are forced to reconcile with the fact that progress is rarely a smooth, upward trajectory. It is often uneven, messy, and built upon a series of compromises that those in power prefer to leave unexamined. The Victorian urban experience was a pressure cooker, and the penny pie was the steam that escaped through the cracks. It was a symptom of an environment that was outstripping its own capacity to nurture its people, a signal of a system that had become so large, so detached, and so focused on output that it had lost sight of the individuals who were actually living and dying within it. As we traverse the final stretches of this historical landscape, it is worth pausing to consider the resilience of the people themselves. They were not merely victims of their circumstances, they were navigators of a reality that was exceptionally difficult to survive. They possessed a pragmatism that is difficult for us to fathom, a groundedness that allowed them to find sustenance where others might only see waste or hazard. They lived in the intersection of the Victorian obsession with morality and the absolute unforgiving demand of the stomach. To understand them is to understand a dimension of the human spirit that is often missing from our current, more comfortable narratives. We are products of that same spirit, descendants of a lineage that learned to persevere, to adapt, and to find warmth in the most unlikely of places. The history of the penny pie is, ultimately, a story of how we manage to keep moving forward, even when the road beneath our feet is built on secrets that we would rather not know. As our journey through the fog-laden streets of 19th-century London draws to a close, we are left with the lingering scent of that penny pie, a smell that was once the very essence of urban survival. We have walked the line between the opulent dining rooms of the elite and the subterranean, coal-dusted kitchens where the real, gritty work of the city was done. We have uncovered the secret ingredients, the ugly arithmetic, and the silent social contracts that allowed a city of millions to function on a diet of necessity and denial. It has been a long and winding road, leading us through the dark heart of an empire and back to a place of quiet reflection. In this final moment, consider what this story has truly been about. It was never just about the food. It was about the people, the nameless millions who rose in the dark, laboured in the heat, and found their only comfort in a handheld pastry that asked for nothing more than a copper coin. It was about the fragility of our own comforts, and the realization that history is not a static set of dates, but a living, breathing tapestry of human experience, woven with threads of survival, deception, and undeniable strength. We are the inheritors of that history, and our modern world is built upon the lessons and the sacrifices of those who came before us. If you have enjoyed this long-form journey into the hidden machinery of the Victorian age, please know that your presence here, listening to these stories, is what breathes life back into the past. We have explored the depths of the 18th and 19th centuries, from the lives of domestic servants to the cold realities of the Little Ice Age, and there are still so many more stories waiting in the shadows. If you haven't already, I invite you to join our growing community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your continued support, your thoughtful comments, and your shared curiosity are the fuel that keeps this platform burning. As you step away from this story and return to the present, perhaps you will look at the world a little differently. Perhaps you will see the hidden layers of the city around you, or appreciate the ease with which we can now know the source of our meals. The history of the penny pie may be a secret of the past, but the humanity that it reveals is timeless. Thank you for walking through this fog with me. Thank you for your patience, your attention, and your empathy. We have explored the secrets of the crust, the gravy, and the dark urban arithmetic that defined a century, and together we have ensured that these forgotten voices are heard once more. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep finding the beauty in the depth of history. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. There is a strange, lingering echo of the Victorian penny pie in our modern world, one that we often fail to recognize. We live in an era of unprecedented clarity. We have labels, certifications, and rigorous health standards that dictate exactly what goes into our food, from the farm to the fork. We are the most informed consumers in human history. Yet as we stand in the brightly lit aisles of our modern grocery stores, surrounded by an abundance that would have been unimaginable to a Londoner in 1850, we often feel a sense of disconnection. We know the ingredients, but do we truly know the story of our food? The Victorian labourer, despite the danger of his meal, had an intimate, if tragic, connection to the urban machinery that sustained him. He knew the vendor by name, he knew the cart that arrived every morning, he knew the baker who worked in the basement down the street. It was a localized, tangible, and deeply human cycle. Today, our food travels thousands of miles, processed in factories that are invisible to us, and wrapped in packaging that obscures the reality of its production. We have traded the uncertainty of the penny pie for the anonymity of the modern supply chain. The question arises, have we gained safety at the expense of our understanding of the world around us? Consider the psychological weight of this shift. In the Victorian age, the anxiety was about the secret ingredient, the fear that the system was deceiving you. Today, our anxiety is often about the hidden cost, the environmental impact, the labour practices in distant countries, the systemic issues that we cannot see from our own vantage point. We are still in many ways grappling with the same fundamental challenge that the Victorians faced: how to remain connected to the essential, life-sustaining act of eating in a world that is becoming increasingly complex, increasingly industrial, and increasingly distant from the natural sources of our sustenance. This is not to suggest that we should return to the shadows of the past, but rather to encourage a renewed sense of mindfulness in our own time. History is not just a record of what happened, it is a repository of lessons that we are constantly relearning. The story of the penny pie is a reminder that every convenience we enjoy is built upon a history of negotiation. It encourages us to look beyond the surface of our own daily habits, to ask questions about the systems that serve us, and to maintain a sense of empathy for the global network of individuals who keep our modern world turning. As we continue to reflect on these hidden narratives, we find that the past has much to tell us about how to navigate the present. It teaches us that while the systems change, the human need for connection, for understanding, and for meaning remains a constant. The fog of 19th century London may have lifted, but the lessons it left behind are as relevant today as they were when the first penny pie was handed over in the damp, crowded streets of the city. It is a curious quirk of history that the very things that once terrified us, or that we once viewed with deep suspicion, eventually become the comfortable foundations of our heritage. The penny pie, once the target of suspicion and the subject of whispered rumours in the dark corners of the city, has survived the century. It has transformed. In the centuries that followed, the meat pie moved from the street corner vendor to the baker's window, then to the dining table, and finally into the pantheon of national dishes. It has been refined, regulated, and reimagined, yet at its heart it remains the same simple, comforting idea: a savoury filling encased in a protective crust. When we look at the meat pie today, we don't think of the Smithfield butcher's yard or the damp basement kitchens. We think of hearths, home cooking, and the warmth of a meal that has stood the test of time. But should we forget the shadows from which it emerged? I believe there is value in remembering the darker origins. By acknowledging the secret ingredients of the past, we gain a deeper appreciation for the regulations, the transparency, and the safety that we enjoy today. We understand that our modern world was not a given, it was an achievement, earned through a long, slow process of challenging the systems that failed us. The story of the penny pie is ultimately a testament to the power of the urban narrative. It is a story about how a city in its struggle to survive creates its own culture, a culture that is as much about the food we eat as it is about the struggles we face. The Victorians built a world of steel, coal, and steam, and they sustained it with their ingenuity, their compromises, and their resilience. Every time we enjoy the comfort of a meal today, we are in a sense participating in the long, unbroken chain of human survival that links us back to those fog-drenched streets. As we reflect on the entirety of this history, it is clear that the penny pie was not just a meal, it was a character in the great unfolding drama of the 19th century. It was there on the cold mornings, there in the tired hands of the labourers, and there in the shared silence of a city that was moving faster than it could ever truly understand. We have pulled back the curtain. We have explored the machinery of the trade, and we have listened to the voices that are now long silent. This journey has not just been about the past, it has been about understanding the complexities of progress and the endurance of the human spirit. The fog may have cleared, but the stories it protected remain with us, waiting to be retold, waiting to be understood, and waiting to remind us of where we have come from. History is often written by the victors, recorded in the ledgers of the powerful, and preserved in the monuments of the wealthy. But the true heart of history, the pulse of a society, is often found in the places that leave no monument behind. The basement kitchens, the crowded tenements, and the soot-stained corners of the Smithfield markets are not found in the grand archives of the state. They have vanished, reclaimed by time, replaced by the glass and steel of a newer, brighter century. Yet they are not entirely lost. They exist in the stories we tell, in the questions we ask, and in the persistent, quiet curiosity that drives us to look beyond the surface of what we are told. When we narrate these forgotten lives, we are not just reviving a past, we are acknowledging the dignity of those who lived it. The labourers of the 19th century were not just statistics in an industrial report, they were people with lives as rich, as complex, and as fleeting as our own. They were people who sought comfort in a simple meal, who shared whispers in the dark, and who endured the immense pressures of a changing world with a resilience that we would do well to remember. By speaking their stories, we give them a voice, however faint, in the chorus of human history. We affirm that their existence and their struggle mattered. This is the responsibility of the storyteller, to act as a bridge between the silence of the past and the awareness of the present. It is a process of curation, of careful reconstruction, and of profound empathy. When we look at the sickening secret ingredients of the penny pie, we are not looking at a curiosity of the past, we are looking at a reflection of our own human capacity for adaptation. We are seeing ourselves, our own anxieties, our own dependencies, and our own search for meaning mirrored in the dim, flickering light of a Victorian kitchen. As we approach the end of our narrative exploration, let us take a final moment to sit with these reflections. The story of the penny pie is a story that has no clean ending, no final resolution, because it is a story that continues to resonate in the ways we live, the ways we consume, and the ways we relate to the world around us. It is a story that asks us to be more than just consumers. It asks us to be observers, to be thoughtful, and to be keepers of the memory. We are the stewards of this history, the ones who ensure that the lessons of the fog-covered streets are not lost to time. It is a heavy yet rewarding task, one that reminds us that we are all part of a larger, ongoing narrative that stretches far beyond our own lives, into the depths of a past that is always waiting, just beneath the surface to be heard. As the century drew to its close, the very air of London seemed to undergo a transformation. The relentless, choking coal smoke that had defined the Victorian sky began to meet its match in the form of bureaucratic scrutiny. The era of the laissez-faire street vendor, operating in the grey zones of morality and sanitation, was coming to an end. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow tectonic shift in the urban consciousness. The introduction of public health reforms, the expansion of municipal oversight, and the gradual professionalization of the culinary trades began to tighten the loop around the clandestine kitchens that had sustained the working class for decades. One could almost feel the change on the streets. The informal economy that had thrived in the shadows of Smithfield and the back alleys of the East End found itself increasingly hemmed in by the reach of the law. Inspectors, those harbingers of the new administrative age, began to frequent the markets, their eyes trained on the quality of ingredients, the cleanliness of preparation, and the origin of supplies. The secret deliveries at midnight, the unmarked barrels of mysterious flesh, and the basement-level production lines that had operated with impunity for so long were now under threat of exposure. It was the end of a unique, if darker, form of urban entrepreneurship. But what did this mean for the people who had relied on these humble pies? The transformation was deeply personal for the millions who had come to depend on the cheap, hot sustenance of the penny pie. For them, the introduction of standards was a double-edged sword. While it promised safety and cleanliness, it also signalled the rise of prices and the decline of accessibility. The penny pie, by virtue of its very quality, had been the only affordable option. As regulations forced improvements, the cost of production inevitably climbed, pushing the humble snack out of the reach of the poorest of the poor. This brings us to a profound reflection on the nature of progress. Is the refinement of a city, the sanitization of its habits, and the regulation of its commerce always a benefit to the most vulnerable? The history of the Victorian food supply suggests that progress often demands a high price, and that the most advanced systems can inadvertently strip away the supports that the most desperate rely upon. As we look at the transition into the early 20th century, we see a city that was becoming healthier, yes, but also more exclusionary. The penny pie trade, with all its moral ambiguities and systemic failures, had been a direct response to the reality of 19th-century life. Its decline was the end of an era of raw, unvarnished survival, replaced by a structure that promised much but could not always provide for all. The streets of London were becoming cleaner, but they were also losing a piece of their character, the grit, the improvisation, and the brutal honesty of an age that was forced to feed itself in the dark. As the political landscape of London shifted, the humble penny pie found itself at the centre of a debate that reached far beyond the bakeries of the East End. It became a matter of concern for the reformers and the politicians alike, who began to view the health of the urban workforce not merely as a private matter, but as a crucial component of the empire's strength. A sick, malnourished or poisoned population was a threat to the machinery of productivity and the stability of the nation. Consequently, the pie trade was no longer a side note in urban commerce. It became a focal point for the growing movement of public health advocacy. Think of the impassioned speeches given in the halls of Parliament, or the investigative pamphlets circulated by social reformers documenting the conditions of the poor. These were not just calls for morality, they were cold-blooded assessments of human capital. The sickening secret ingredients were no longer just a source of urban legend, they were being framed as a systemic failure, a flaw in the design of the industrial city. The government, once content to let the market regulate itself with a blind eye, started to recognise that the unregulated trade of questionable meat was a liability that the state could no longer afford to ignore. This tension between the demand for cheap, quick fuel for the masses and the emerging ethical standards of the nation created a unique social conflict. You can visualise the clash of these interests. The desperate vendor defending his right to trade, the hungry labourer fearing the loss of his only hot meal, and the zealous reformer pushing for a standard of purity that felt to many like a luxury they could not afford. It was a struggle over the definition of a fair society. What did the state owe its citizens in terms of the food that sustained them, and what were the citizens prepared to sacrifice in the name of safety? This era of transition reveals a crucial lesson about the nature of power and policy. When a society begins to demand transparency, it is usually because it has reached a breaking point, a moment where the secret costs of the status quo have become too visible to be ignored. The Victorian era was that turning point. It was a time when the gap between the reality of the streets and the ideals of the government started to close, slowly and painfully. The penny pie trade was the front line of this conflict. It was here, in the exchange of a copper coin for a pastry of unknown origins, that the battle for the future of urban health was being fought, one transaction at a time. This historical struggle reminds us that the standards we take for granted today, the labels on our products, the hygiene of our restaurants, the transparency of our supply chains were not inevitable. They were hard-won gains, forged in the heat of a struggle that involved everyone from the anonymous labourer in the tenement to the politician in the gilded hall. To understand the life cycle of the penny pie, one must look beyond the baker and the street corner vendor, and instead turn our gaze to the most shadowy stratum of the urban economy, the collectors. In the hierarchy of Victorian commerce, these were the individuals tasked with a job that no one wanted, but everyone relied upon. They were the intermediaries between the high-end butchers of Smithfield, where the prime cuts were destined for the tables of the wealthy, and the subterranean bakeries where the penny pies were born. Their trade was not documented in the respectable ledgers of the city. It was an informal, transactional reality that kept the wheels of industry turning. Picture the docks and the markets in the grey hours before dawn. As the high-end cuts of beef and mutton were being carefully prepared for the elite, there remained a vast unsightly remainder, the trimmings, the odd pieces of organ meat, and the connective tissues that were deemed unsuitable for fine dining. In a less organised city, this would have been waste, a sanitation nightmare waiting to happen, but in Victorian London, waste was considered an inefficiency that could not be afforded. This is where the collectors stepped in. With their carts and their rudimentary preservation techniques, they gathered these remnants, transforming what was essentially trash into a viable commodity for the burgeoning pie trade. This was a masterful, if macabre, example of urban symbiosis. The high-end butcher was happy to offload his trimmings, often for a pittance, and the baker was thrilled to receive a steady supply of low-cost protein. It was a deal made in the dark, driven by the cold necessity of urban arithmetic. But consider the moral geography of this exchange. The butcher maintained his reputation for quality, the baker maintained his margin for profit, and the labourer received his meal. Everyone was satisfied, as long as the true nature of the supply chain remained unspoken. This was the hidden social fabric of the city, a network of silence and necessity that connected the opulent dining room to the basement tenement. As we dissect this, we must acknowledge the sheer organisational skill required to manage such a supply chain. There were no telephones, no central dispatch, and no formal logistics network to coordinate these flows of material. It was a system built entirely on reputation, physical proximity, and a shared understanding of the rules. The collectors knew which butchers produced the most valuable waste, and the bakers knew which collectors could be trusted to deliver the goods before they became completely unsalvageable. It was a primitive, highly efficient network that operated on the fringe of legality, driven by the absolute relentless demand for food that would not break the bank. In this we see the true Victorian genius, the ability to find opportunity in the most overlooked and unappealing corners of the urban landscape. It was a world of brutal pragmatism, where the line between resource and refuse was constantly being negotiated, and where the most successful entrepreneurs were those who could turn the city's leftovers into its most vital fuel. As this system of supply grew more refined, the line between usable protein and hazardous waste began to blur with dangerous frequency. The collectors, driven by the pressure to meet the constant demand of the pie makers, often grew careless. In their rush to clear the markets, they would include items that any responsible butcher would have discarded, meat that was already showing the mottled discoloration of decay, or the pervasive, sickly sweet scent of early spoilage. The bakers, in turn, under pressure to maintain their price point, developed an almost ritualistic approach to remediation. They learned that by boiling these scraps for extra hours, or by layering them with pungent, sharp-tasting herbs and spices, they could mask the reality of the ingredients. This created a society where the threat of illness was an ever-present, almost mundane reality. It was not uncommon for a labourer to return home from his shift with a debilitating stomach cramp, or to spend his one day of rest shivering with a fever that no one could quite explain. In the narrow, overcrowded tenements, these sicknesses were often attributed to the damp air, the miasma of the city, or simply the exhaustion of the work. Rarely was the connection made to the penny pie that had been eaten for lunch. This was a triumph of denial. The pie was such an essential part of the day's rhythm that to question it was, in a sense, to question the only source of sustenance available. Consider the tragedy of this normalization. The pain and the physical suffering of the working class became part of the background noise of the city. There was no medical oversight for the average labourer, no public health body to track the clusters of foodborne illnesses that swept through the factory districts. If a man fell ill, he simply missed a day of work and lost a day's wages before returning to the factory, hungrier than before and likely to purchase the same meal once more. It was a vicious cycle that reinforced itself. The pie was the cause of the ailment, and the ailment ensured that the worker remained in a state of desperation where he could only afford the pie. As we examine this, we must recognize that this was not a failure of individual morality, but a failure of a system that prioritized output over the well-being of its people. The ugly urban arithmetic we have discussed reached its most poignant realization here. The cost of feeding the industrial workforce was being paid in the health of the very people who were building the empire. They were the anonymous, silent casualties of a progress that demanded their labour, but denied them the basic right to safe sustenance. The Victorian penny pie, therefore, was not just a symbol of innovation or urban efficiency, it was a testament to the profound inequality that defined the era. It was a meal that kept the city moving, even as it quietly eroded the health of those who powered it. It is a haunting reflection on the hidden costs of our collective ambitions. A reminder that when we prioritize efficiency above all else, the most vulnerable are often the ones who bear the burden of the inevitable consequences. As the penny pie became a fixture of the industrial landscape, a strange folklore began to coalesce around it. In the soot-choked air of the factory floor, during the brief hurried breaks, stories would circulate about the provenance of the meat. These were rarely substantiated, yet they were spoken of with a mix of dark humour and morbid fascination. Was it really beef? Was it mutton? Or was it, as the more cynical workers suggested, something else entirely? The unwanted remnants of the city's back alleys, or creatures that had no business being in a pie at all. This urban myth-making was more than mere gossip. It was a psychological defence mechanism. By turning the pie into a subject of macabre speculation, the labourers were, in a sense, exerting a small measure of control over the uncontrollable. If you could joke about the pie's origin, if you could frame it as a dangerous mystery, it became less a symbol of your own desperate poverty and more a character in the grim theatre of London life. This was the dark comedy of the streets. It allowed a man to consume his meal without fully confronting the reality that he was likely eating the very definition of bottom-tier waste. It was a way to maintain a shred of dignity in an environment that seemed designed to strip it away. Yet there was also a pervasive, unspoken anxiety that shadowed these rumours. You would see it in the way a man might pause before his first bite, a momentary hesitation that betrayed the suspicion lurking beneath his pragmatism. He knew in some recess of his mind that the penny he had paid was too small to purchase true quality. He knew that the system relied on deception, and yet he would eat. He would eat because the gnawing, sharp-edged hunger in his belly was a more immediate and compelling reality than any rumour about a baker's secret pantry. This is the ultimate heartbreaking truth of the Victorian urban experience, the absolute subjugation of the individual's concern for health to the biological imperative of survival. This psychological divide, the distance between what one knew and what one felt compelled to do, is the true, untold story of the penny pie era. It was a society that had learned to live in a state of suspended belief. They were a people who looked into the abyss of their own sustenance every single day and chose to look away, to laugh at the stories, and to keep their heads down, focused on the grueling, endless work of the industrial age. We see in this a terrifying mirror for our own times, the ease with which human beings can adapt to a compromised reality, and the way that the most systemic, brutal inequities can be rendered invisible by the sheer, repetitive necessity of our daily lives. The penny pie was not just food, it was a test of the limits of human endurance and a testament to how effectively a society can hide its own dark foundations in plain sight. As the Victorian era marched toward its conclusion, the streets of London became a battleground of perception. The authorities, fueled by a newly invigorated sense of civic pride and a desire to present London as the civilized heart of a global empire, began to view the mobile pie cart not as a vital source of sustenance, but as an unsightly blot on the urban landscape. It was no longer just about the health of the citizens, it was about the aesthetics of the city itself. The rickety carts, the grease-stained pavements, and the crowds of unwashed labourers congregating on street corners were seen as antithetical to the image of progress that the city planners wished to project. The implementation of stricter licensing laws and public order ordinances became the new instruments of control. It was a systematic effort to purify the streets, to move the informal economy out of sight and into the shadows, or better yet, to eliminate it altogether. We can imagine the scene, the arrival of the local constable, the sudden frantic dispersal of the vendors, the overturned carts and the spilled inventory, a brief violent disruption in the daily rhythm of the city. For the labourers, this was more than just a disruption. It was a threat to their access to affordable food. To them, the cart was a lifeline. To the state, it was a public nuisance that needed to be managed, regulated or erased. This shift underscores a recurring theme in the history of urban development, the tendency to prioritize order over the immediate needs of the disenfranchised. In the name of a cleaner London, the informal networks of support that had allowed the poor to survive were being dismantled, replaced by a structure that favored the established business and the regulated shopfront. It was a transition that favored the visible, respectable commerce over the messy, hidden reality of survival. The labourers, already marginalised by their economic status, now found themselves further alienated by the very systems that were supposed to be improving their quality of life. The consequence was a deeper, more profound kind of invisibility. As the carts were pushed further into the periphery, as the vendors were forced to operate with even greater secrecy, the entire trade became an underground, defensive operation. It was no longer a public feature of the industrial day. It was a hidden, illicit activity. This period of transition is a sobering reminder that the progress of a city is often a matter of perspective. While the grand boulevards were being paved and the architectural monuments to industry were being erected, the reality of the working-class struggle was being quietly pushed into the margins. The penny pie, once the vibrant, albeit greasy, symbol of the city's industrial energy, was now becoming a symbol of the forgotten, a reminder of a struggle that the city, in its rush to modernize, would rather pretend did not exist. To truly grasp the reality of the penny pie, one must descend, literally, into the architecture of the era. The London of the Victorian imagination is often one of sweeping bridges and grand glass stations, but the London of the labourer was one of damp, subterranean foundations. The kitchens where the penny pies were prepared were almost exclusively located in the basement levels of the overcrowded tenement buildings. These were spaces designed for storage, not for human industry, and certainly not for the preparation of food. They were places where the city's dampness collected, where the air was heavy with the smell of coal smoke, rotting refuse, and the cloying metallic scent of rendering meat. Imagine the environment. The floor, typically comprised of uneven stone or packed dirt, was constantly slick with condensation and the accidental spills of a long day's work. The only light came from flickering tallow candles or the dim, filtered greyness that managed to descend from the narrow street-level window, which was usually blocked by the debris of the alleyway. This was the black box of the urban economy. Here, in the subterranean silence, the noise of the bustling city above was muffled to a low, constant vibration, the thrum of carriages and horses on the cobblestones serving as a reminder of a world that felt fundamentally disconnected from this dark, cramped reality. Within these chambers, the production of the pie was an act of constant, grueling motion. The bakers worked in the half-light, their hands coated in a mixture of flour, grease and soot. There was no room for the modern concepts of workspace organization. Tools were shared, surfaces were improvised, and the ingredients were kept in containers that offered little protection against the rats that were an inescapable fact of life in the lower depths. The heat from the primitive, often dangerously vented ovens would turn these rooms into stifling, oxygen-deprived traps, especially during the sweltering summer months. Yet this was the crucible of the industrial diet. It is a striking contradiction that the energy for the most powerful empire in history was being synthesized in spaces that were fundamentally unfit for human habitation. The basement kitchen was the shadow self of the Victorian home, while the upper floors aspired to domestic refinement. The cellar was the site of a brutal, unadorned fight for efficiency. It highlights the stark social stratification of the time, not just in terms of wealth, but in terms of exposure to the elements of the city. The wealthy lived in the light of the upper stories, while the infrastructure of their society, its waste management, its food production, and its most marginalized workforce was buried beneath them, out of sight and out of mind. The penny pie, therefore, was a product of this profound displacement, a tangible piece of the city's hidden, subterranean life that was pushed, one penny at a time, up into the streets to fuel the engines of the world above. There was a peculiar, heavy silence that permeated these basement workshops, a silence born not of peace, but of necessity. To speak too loudly of the conditions in the cellar, to question the quality of the ingredients, or to draw attention to the sheer misery of the work was to jeopardize one's survival. It was a culture of profound, enforced discretion. The labourer knew that the city above existed in a state of delicate balance, that for the wealthy to dine in comfort, the foundations of their comfort, the labour, the cleaning, the food preparation, had to remain invisible. And so the workers in the deep, damp shadows became the silent architects of the city's daily rhythm, their voices swallowed by the heavy, coal-dusted air. This silence was more than just fear, it was a form of endurance. The individuals who operated these subterranean kitchens often felt a grim pride in their ability to perform their duties despite the environment. They were the ones who understood the ugly urban arithmetic better than anyone, who knew how to transform the city's unwanted remnants into something that could, at the very least, stave off the worst of the hunger. They were the custodians of a secret that the rest of London seemed desperate to ignore. It was a shared, unspoken pact between the producer and the consumer. As long as the pie was hot, as long as it was affordable, and as long as it could be eaten on the move, the details of its creation would remain beneath the cobblestones. When we observe this from the distance of time, we are struck by the immense psychological toll of this existence. To live and work in a place where the sun never reaches, where the primary environment is one of decay and industrial waste, is to occupy a different reality than the one enjoyed by the citizens above. It creates a psychological severance, a feeling of being permanently othered by the very work one performs. These basement kitchens were not just workplaces, they were, for all intents and purposes, a world apart. They were the dark, forgotten engines of the Industrial Revolution, and their inhabitants were the silent gears that kept the machine running without ever demanding acknowledgement. Consider the tragedy of this disconnect. The Victorian dream of progress was built on the premise that the city was a unified, coherent entity moving toward a brighter future. But for those in the cellars, the future was simply the next day's shift, the next batch of pies, and the next copper coin. They were detached from the grand narratives of empire, of expansion, and of moral improvement. Their lives were defined by the immediate, the granular, and the physical. By creating this layer of subterranean activity, the city was able to maintain its facade of refinement and progress. It was a masterpiece of urban design, a way of isolating the grimy, uncomfortable realities of industrial life in the foundations of the buildings, leaving the surface clear for the veneer of Victorian morality to be displayed in all its polished glory. The penny pie, in this light, was the link between these two worlds, a bridge built of flour and mystery, carrying the weight of the forgotten labourers into the mouths of the city that refused to see them. As the late Victorian era progressed, the act of eating began to change, not just in the dining rooms of the elite, but on the soot-covered street corners where the penny pie reigned supreme. There was a subtle shift in the labourer's relationship with his meal. For years, the pie had been treated as a mechanical necessity, an intake of calories designed to suppress hunger until the final factory whistle blew. But slowly, the repetitive numbing experience of the mystery meat began to lose its efficacy. The stomach, it seemed, began to rebel before the mind did. It started with small observational remarks shared during the lunch hour, a comment about the gristle in a pie, a question regarding the strange metallic tang of the gravy, or a look shared between two workers. These were the initial cracks in the facade of collective acceptance. The silence we spoke of earlier, that heavy cloak of enforced discretion, began to fray. Workers started to notice that their counterparts in other industries, or those who had managed to climb a rung higher on the economic ladder, were eating food that actually resembled what it claimed to be. The comparison was involuntary, and once made it was impossible to unsee. This was the birth of a new kind of consciousness. The penny pie ceased to be just a source of energy. It became a symbol of what the worker was denied. It became an artifact of their own status. To eat the penny pie was to accept one's place in the lowest tier of the industrial hierarchy. to accept that one's health and well-being were secondary to the output of the factory. And as the socialist movements began to find their voice, and as unions started to articulate the grievances of the working class, this realization found its way into the very food they consumed. The industrial age had promised prosperity, yet for the man holding a penny pie in his calloused hands, that promise felt increasingly like a distant, unreachable mirage. The pie wasn't just fueling the machine, it was keeping the worker trapped in a cycle of marginalization. They began to realize that the secret ingredients were not just a failure of sanitation, but a manifestation of the system's inherent indifference to them. This realization was the first step toward a more active and eventually a more rebellious engagement with the world. They were no longer just passive consumers of whatever the basement kitchens produced. They were becoming observers of their own conditions. The penny pie was becoming the pivot point, the focal object through which the harsh realities of the era were being processed and challenged. The streets of London were beginning to vibrate with a new collective energy, one that was fueled not just by the hunger of the body, but by the awakening of a consciousness that would eventually demand more from the world it had built. Looking back from our vantage point in the 21st century, the story of the penny pie feels like a cautionary tale, yet it is also a mirror. We too find ourselves navigating a world where the production of our daily sustenance is often obscured by layers of industrial complexity. We have our own versions of the basement kitchen, factories thousands of miles away, supply chains that are intentionally opaque, and an economic system that thrives when we, as consumers, choose convenience over curiosity. The Victorian labourer's struggle to reconcile his hunger with his suspicion is not a relic of the past, it is the fundamental struggle of the modern consumer. The awakening we witnessed in the late Victorian streets, that slow, painful shift from passive consumption to critical awareness, is the same process that drives our contemporary movements for food transparency and ethical sourcing. When we pause to read a label, when we question the ethics of a global brand, or when we choose to support local visible producers, we are participating in the same historical arc. We are the beneficiaries of that hard-won realization that the food we eat is never truly just food. It is the result of human labor, of systemic policy, and of choices made by those who hold power over the machinery of production. This brings us to a profound realization about the nature of historical narrative. History is not a distant, static country that we visit and then leave behind. It is a living dialogue. Every time we engage with the story of the past, we are adding our own layer of understanding to it. The labourers who stood in the rain eating their questionable pies were the pioneers of our modern critical consumerism. They were the first to confront the reality of an industrial food system and to feel the weight of its indifference. Their hunger was the catalyst for the scrutiny that we today take for granted as our right. As we continue to hold these histories in our minds, we find that our connection to those who came before us is closer than we might imagine. We are linked by the same daily necessity of nourishment, the same desire for safety, and the same drive to understand the world around us. The story of the penny pie was, at its core, a story about the search for dignity in an age that prioritized output over the individual. By honoring that search, by recognizing the hidden costs of our own comforts, and by refusing to remain silent about the systems that shape our world, we ensure that the lessons of the Victorian fog are not lost. We are the inheritors of their struggle, and it is our responsibility to continue the work of bringing the hidden costs of our world into the light, ensuring that the hunger for truth is as vital as the hunger for sustenance. As the gears of the 20th century began to turn with newfound mechanical precision, the physical remnants of the penny pie era, the rickety carts, the grease-darkened alleyways, the subterranean kitchens were systematically erased. It was as if the city, in its rush to embrace a cleaner, brighter future, felt a compulsion to sweep away the evidence of its own messy, survivalist past. The basement entrances were bricked up, the markets were renovated, and the informal economy was regulated into extinction. Yet, in that process of erasure, the penny pie did not just vanish, It underwent a metamorphosis. It transformed from a daily grinding reality into a ghost of the Victorian imagination. It is a curious phenomenon of history. The things we once found most unsettling are often the ones we later romanticize. The sickening secret ingredients that once provoked anxiety became the grist for the mill of urban legend. Writers, social commentators, and eventually historians began to look back at the Victorian streets not with the dread of the contemporary labourer, but with the detached fascination of the observer. The gritty, soot-stained desperation of the past was polished into a narrative of character. We began to admire the resilience of the Victorian poor, forgetting that their resilience was not a choice, but a requirement of survival in a system that offered them nothing else. This sanitization of history is a dangerous luxury. By turning the penny pie into a piece of quaint folklore, we detach it from the harsh, systemic realities that birthed it. We stop asking about the labourers who died of foodborne illnesses. We stop questioning the lack of regulation that allowed for such exploitation, and we start viewing the era through a lens of sepia-toned nostalgia. But if we look closely, beneath the layers of time and the myth-making of the decades, the truth remains those pies were the physical manifestation of a society that prioritized its industrial output above the humanity of its workers. The pie was a symptom, a visible indicator of an underlying sickness that the city refused to name. As we stand on this side of history, we must be careful not to let the legend replace the lesson. The story of the penny pie is not just a tale of quaint street food or peculiar 19th-century habits. It is a testament to the power of the urban machine and the way it consumes human lives to sustain its own momentum. To remember it correctly is to remember the silence, the hunger, and the quiet dignity of those who worked in the dark so that the world above could live in the light. It is a challenge to our modern perspective. How do we view the invisible workers of our own age, those who occupy the metaphorical basement kitchens of our global economy? Are we still looking away, waiting for time to transform our own systemic failures into the romantic folklore of the future? If you walk the streets of modern London today, searching for the ghost of the penny pie, you will find very little to satisfy your curiosity. The subterranean chambers have been repurposed, reinforced, or sealed away entirely, swallowed by the deep foundations of office towers and luxury apartments. The city has effectively renovated its memory. Yet, there are moments, perhaps on a particularly damp evening when the fog rolls in from the Thames, or in the deep stillness of a basement level where the air feels heavy with the scent of old earth, where you might feel a sudden jarring sense of dissonance. It is as if the city itself is breathing, revealing the faint, rhythmic pulse of an era that never quite vanished. These are the moments when history asserts itself. It is a reminder that our modern stability is built upon a substrate of intense, often brutal struggle. We occupy the same geography as those anonymous labourers, yet we walk through a world that has been scrubbed clean of their immediate presence. This is the profound irony of the urban experience. We are surrounded by the past, yet we move through it with such purposeful, modern detachment that we rarely acknowledge the foundations we stand upon. The penny pie, once a symbol of the city's frantic industrial energy, is now just a footnote, a minor detail in the grand evolution of a global metropolis. But consider the people who inhabited these spaces. Their lives were not footnotes. They were the protagonists of their own dramas, their own joys, and their own immense, unrecorded hardships. They were the ones who navigated the sickening secret ingredients with a stoic pragmatism that we can barely comprehend today. When we ignore their history, when we treat the Victorian basement kitchens as mere curiosities of a bygone age, we do them a disservice. We lose the opportunity to recognize that the evolution of our society, from the unregulated chaos of the 19th century to the structured, transparent systems of the 21st, is a continuous, fragile achievement that requires our constant critical attention. As we reach the closing chapters of our exploration, let us not be too quick to turn the page. The story of the penny pie is a lingering question directed at us. It asks how we define progress. It asks us to look at the shadows we cast in our own time, the the trade-offs we accept, and the people we rely upon without ever knowing their names. It is a story that in its final analysis is not about pies, nor about the 19th century, but about the human capacity for endurance and the ongoing, often hidden cost of civilization. It is a story that demands that we be better observers, that we be more conscious of our dependencies, and that we carry the weight of the past not as a burden, but as a lens through which we can better understand the complexities of our present. The fog has lifted, the streets have been paved, but the search for truth, the essential human task, continues. In the heart of modern London, beneath the hum of traffic and the neon glow of storefronts, there is a dormant layer of history that refuses to be completely silent. It is a mistake to think of the Victorian era as a closed chapter. Rather, it is the underlying current that feeds the river of our contemporary existence. Every time we walk through the narrow, twisting passages of the older districts, we are walking on the same paths where the penny pie carts once rattled. The city is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over again, where the faded ink of the 19th century still shapes the contours of our current reality. The labour, the struggle, and the relentless survivalism of those who walked these streets before us are etched into the very masonry of the city. We often think of history as a progression toward clarity, as if we are slowly emerging from a fog into the bright, sharp light of absolute truth. But perhaps it is more honest to see history as a process of layering. We add our own complexities to the foundations laid by those in the subterranean kitchens. We carry their anxieties, their methods of endurance, and their quiet reliance on the systems they helped create. The penny pie, in its humble, greasy complexity, was a precursor to the globalized, complex, and often opaque systems of production that sustain us today. By acknowledging its history, we are not just looking backward, we are examining the DNA of our own world. Consider what it truly means to inhabit a city built by millions of invisible hands. We are constantly interacting with the legacies of people whose names are lost to time, but whose efforts, the buildings they constructed, the streets they paved, the social frameworks they forced into existence, continue to dictate the terms of our lives. The penny pie seller, the labourer who bought his lunch in the dark, the inspector who eventually brought the law to the alleyway, they were all participants in a grand collaborative project of civilization. They were the ones who negotiated the terms of what was acceptable, what was safe, and what was necessary. As we dwell on this, we find a sense of continuity that is both humbling and empowering. We are not isolated individuals living in a static moment of now. We are part of an unfolding collective narrative that bridges the gap between the basement kitchens of the past and the illuminated skyscrapers of the present. The silence of the 19th century labourer is not a void, it is a question, a constant, low-frequency signal that asks us to remember, to value, and to question. It reminds us that every modern convenience, every piece of transparent policy, and every safety standard we enjoy has been paid for with the resilience of those who had none. The fog of the Victorian age may have long since burned off, but the city it left behind, with all its depth, its history, and its hidden echoes, is the very stage upon which we now write our own part of the story. There is an art to observing a city. It requires more than just sight. It requires a kind of historical hearing, the ability to listen to the echoes of the past that resonate beneath the noise of the present. When we walk the streets of London today, we are effectively walking through a museum of human endurance, though one where most of the exhibits are invisible. The penny pie, with its murky origins and its essential role in the survival of the masses, is one such exhibit. It was the fuel for the industrial engine, the silent witness to 1,000 quiet struggles, and a marker of a time when the gap between the haves and the have-nots was measured in the quality of one's daily bread. To understand this is to change how you experience the city itself. You stop seeing buildings as static structures and start seeing them as containers of human effort. You look at the alleyway and you don't just see a shortcut, you see a corridor of necessity where the anonymous workers of the past hurried through the rain, clutching their hot, steaming and deeply suspect meals. You look at the stone steps leading down to a basement, and you feel the weight of the generations who descended into those depths to perform work that kept the lights of the empire burning. This is the archaeology of the spirit, a way of engaging with history that honors the reality of the people who lived it, rather than just the grandeur of the monuments they left behind. We must also recognize that this engagement is a choice. We could easily pass through our days in a state of comfortable ignorance, viewing the past as a collection of quaint, disconnected facts, but to do so is to deny ourselves the richness of our own human context. When we choose to look closer, when we dare to imagine the smell of the coal smoke, the dampness of the stone, and the biting cold of a London winter, we bridge the distance of a century. We acknowledge that the human condition, the drive to survive, the need for community, and the persistent, quiet hope for a better day remains the constant, unchanging pulse of history. This reflection brings us to the realization that we are not observers of history, but participants in its ongoing momentum. The penny pie era was a crucible that forged the standards of our own time, and by looking back at it with empathy and critical awareness, we are in a sense paying our respects to those who endured. We are the keepers of their stories, the ones who ensure that the secret ingredients of their lives, their struggles, their ingenuity, and their quiet daily sacrifices are not completely lost to the erasure of progress. In the quiet, measured rhythm of our own lives, we carry the echoes of theirs. We are the synthesis of their past and the architects of our own future, walking the same streets, breathing the same air, and forever defined by the legacy of the hidden, the hungry, and the resilient. As we near the conclusion of this traversal through time, the figure of the penny pie stands out not as a mere curiosity, but as a sentinel, a marker of the point where the raw, unfiltered struggle for survival began to clash with the burgeoning ideals of a modern, regulated society. We have traced this journey from the damp, subterranean kitchens of the East End, where the only objective was to transform the city's refuse into calories, to the grand, administrative halls of Parliament, where the health of the workforce was finally debated as a matter of national interest. This shift, while seemingly dry and bureaucratic, was a monumental transformation in human experience. It was the moment we decided as a society that the survival of the individual was not just a private tragedy, but a public responsibility. We must reflect on the sheer scale of this change. To move from a state of total, brutal indifference to one of established systemic concern is the defining work of the last 2 centuries. The penny pie trade was the final, stubborn remnant of the old world, a world of private, localized and often dangerous improvisation. Its regulation, its eventual decline, and its replacement by standardized, branded and regulated goods represent the death of a certain kind of urban autonomy. We gained safety, yes, and we gained the certainty of quality, but we also lost the raw, unvarnished improvisation that characterized the life of the Victorian masses. It is a trade-off that we are still analyzing today. Consider the resilience of the human spirit that was required to live through this transition. To be a worker in the late 19th century was to exist in a state of permanent tension between the immediate gnawing demand of hunger and the emerging realization that one deserved more than just survivable waste. It was this tension, this quiet, collective realization, that slowly pushed the city toward a more compassionate design. The streets were not cleaned by the benevolence of the elite. They were cleaned because the people who walked them, the ones who fueled the empire on penny pies, finally had enough. As the fog clears from our narrative, we are left with a clearer vision of the interconnectedness of our lives. The history of the penny pie is not a story of the past, it is a story of how we became who we are. It is about how a city in its desperate industrial hunger eventually learned to see its own people. It is a testament to the fact that the most profound changes in history are not always the ones that make the headlines. Sometimes they are the changes that happen on the street corner, in the basement kitchen, and in the quiet, shared understanding between those who work and those who rule. We are the inheritors of this long, slow climb toward dignity, and as we look ahead, We do so with a deeper awareness of the invisible foundations that support the world we call our own. Today, if you wander through the revitalised districts of London, where the brickwork of the past has been cleaned and the ironwork polished to a high sheen, it is easy to forget what lies beneath. These spaces, once the breathing lungs of the industrial machine, have been scrubbed of their soot and their suffering. The basement kitchens, the cramped tenements, and the dark alleyways where the penny pie trade once flourished are now occupied by artisanal cafes, glass-fronted offices and boutiques that cater to a different kind of hunger. The physical erasure is so complete that the memory of the struggle seems to have evaporated into the very air we breathe. This is the ultimate triumph of urban renewal, the ability to curate the past, to select the stories that fit the image of a thriving modern metropolis, and to silence those that do not. We have successfully turned the Victorian industrial landscape into a set piece, a backdrop for our own aspirations, but there is a danger in this curated memory. When we lose the ability to see the shadow selves of our buildings, when we forget that these walls once held the breath of the desperate and the grit of the survivor, we lose a vital part of our own human context. We risk becoming a society that values only the aesthetic, ignoring the profound human cost that was paid to create the ground we stand upon. Think of the contrast. The same ground that once fed a labourer a questionable meal for a penny now supports an economy of abundance, yet the fundamental anxiety of existence remains. We have replaced the struggle for physical sustenance with a struggle for economic security, and we have replaced the uncertainty of the pie with the uncertainty of the gig economy. The environment has changed, the architecture has evolved, but the human experience, the constant navigation of a system that is often indifferent to the individual, is remarkably consistent. The penny pie was a symptom of a specific time, but the underlying tension is a permanent feature of the urban condition. As we look at these spaces, we should not just see the modern veneer. We should see the layers of effort, survival, and adaptation that have defined every generation that walked here before us. We should see the ghost of the penny pie, not as a curiosity of history, but as a reminder that every convenience we enjoy, every safety measure we rely on, and every standard of quality we demand was built on the back of someone's struggle. To be a conscious observer of the city is to acknowledge these layers, to respect the history that is buried in the foundations, and to recognize that we are merely the latest actors on a stage that has been shaped by the resilience of the invisible. It is a sobering yet deeply meaningful way to live, ensuring that as we move forward into the future we carry the light of the past with us, acknowledging the weight, the cost, and the enduring dignity of those who walked before. As our journey through the history of the penny pie reaches its final stages, we find ourselves lingering on the faces of those who never made it into the official archives of Victorian progress. There were no monuments erected to the pie makers of the subterranean kitchens, no plaques dedicated to the labourers whose only respite was a meal of uncertain origin. They were the silent architects of the modern urban experience, the millions of individuals whose daily efforts were subsumed into the greater narrative of national expansion. Their lives were not defined by grand gestures or political speeches, but by the relentless, grinding necessity of surviving another day in the most powerful city on earth. We must recognize that their legacy is not found in the buildings they constructed or the goods they produced, but in the very social infrastructure that we have inherited, the way we view food safety, the way we regulate the public sphere, the way we protect the rights of the worker. These are the direct consequences of the struggles that played out in the alleys and cellars of the 19th century. We are living in a world that was shaped by their indignation, their endurance, and their ultimate refusal to be entirely erased. The penny pie, in all its humble, greasy glory, was the catalyst for a societal awakening that continues to ripple through our own time. Consider the profound weight of this inheritance. When we talk about the progress of civilization, we are essentially talking about the movement from a world of mystery to a world of transparency. Every step we have taken away from the penny pie era is a step toward a reality where the provenance of our sustenance is acknowledged, where the humanity of the producer is recognized, and where the dignity of the consumer is protected by institutional standards. It is a slow, often agonizingly complex climb, but it is one that we are all participating in. We are the inheritors of a struggle that began in the dark, and it is our collective duty to ensure that the light of transparency continues to reach the deepest corners of our global systems. As we stand at the edge of this historical horizon, we feel the weight of those who came before us, the thousands of hands that kneaded the dough, the thousands of feet that paced the cobblestones, and the thousands of voices that whispered their complaints in the dim, soot-choked air. Their story is not a tragedy to be mourned, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It is a reminder that even in the most constrained circumstances, even in the grip of the most unforgiving economic machinery, the human drive to persist, to hope, and to eventually demand better remains the ultimate unstoppable force of history. We are the keepers of their memory, the narrators of their long, silent story, and as we look forward to the future, we do so with the profound, humbling awareness that we are never truly alone. We are walking in the footsteps of those who built the foundation of our world, one penny, one pie, and one day at a time. There is a finality in the way a city changes, a layering of concrete and commerce that eventually obscures the very soil where our predecessors toiled. Yet beneath the slick surfaces of our modern existence, the fundamental rhythms of life remain stubbornly unchanged. We still wake, we still work, and we still seek the nourishment that sustains our days. The penny pie may have vanished, its grease-stained carts replaced by sleek digital interfaces and global supply chains, but the human impulse that drove the Victorian labourer to the street corner remains as potent as ever. We are all, in our own way, searching for sustenance in a world that often feels indifferent to our individual survival. This journey through the fog of Victorian London has been more than a historical exercise. It has been an invitation to look at our own world with refreshed, critical eyes. When we recognise the history of the penny pie, we stop seeing our modern conveniences as givens. We begin to see them as hard-won milestones, the result of a long, often painful evolution from a system of exploitation to a system of shared responsibility. Every regulation we uphold, every standard of quality we expect, and every moment we take to consider the human cost of what we consume is a continuation of the work that began in those damp, dark cellars. As we conclude this segment of our exploration, let us carry with us the lesson of the invisible. The most significant shifts in our society are rarely the ones broadcast from the rooftops. They are the ones that take hold in the hearts of the common people, in the quiet, shared spaces where we confront the realities of our existence. The penny pie sellers and their customers were not just passive participants in an industrial machine, they were the catalysts for a necessary change. Their lives, though often buried in the anonymity of the slums, were the foundation upon which the structures of our contemporary dignity were built. So as we move forward, let us remain attentive. Let us be the ones who acknowledge the invisible foundations of our own world. Let us be the ones who continue to ask the uncomfortable questions about where our sustenance comes from and who pays the price for our daily ease. The story of the penny pie is a legacy of awareness, a challenge to remain conscious of our connections, our responsibilities, and our shared humanity. The fog may have cleared, and the era may have passed into the annals of history, but the search for truth, for equity, and for a more humane way of existing remains the vital, ongoing narrative of our time. As we stand at the precipice of our final reflections, it becomes clear that the story of the penny pie is, at its heart, a story about the fragility of human dignity. We have traced this narrative through the soot and the shadows, finding in the most unlikely of places the greasy, suspect, and desperate food of the industrial poor, the very essence of a society's moral evolution. We have seen how a city, blinded by the frantic pace of its own progress, managed to ignore the suffering that fueled its rise, and we have seen how the slow, inevitable pressure of human need forced that same city to eventually acknowledge, regulate, and protect. But the question remains, what do we do with this realization now that we have stepped out of the fog? History is not meant to be kept in a cabinet of curiosities, it is meant to be held as a mirror to our current lives. If we have learned anything from the bakers in the basement and the labourers on the street corner, it is that the invisible are never truly silent. Their struggles, their compromises, and their persistent demand for a better existence are woven into the fabric of the very systems that sustain us today. We are the beneficiaries of their endurance, and we have a duty to ensure that the progress they fought for is not just maintained but expanded. The future of our global society depends on our ability to see what is hidden in plain sight. It depends on our willingness to question the costs of our conveniences, to challenge the indifference of our systems, and to recognize the humanity of those who labor in the shadows of our own time. The penny pie was a test of the Victorian era's conscience. Our choices, our consumption, and our treatment of those who serve us are the tests of our own. We are not exempt from the responsibilities that come with the comforts of modernity. If anything, we are more accountable than ever before. As we carry this awareness forward, let us remember that the search for a more equitable world is a collective effort. It is not something that is achieved once and for all, but something that must be earned day by day through the actions we take and the empathy we extend. The story of the Victorian poor is a beacon, calling us to look beyond the surface of our polished modern lives, and to acknowledge the interconnectedness of our human experience. It is a call to be more observant, more conscious, and more deeply committed to the well-being of the collective. The legacy of the penny pie is not just a reminder of how far we have come, it is a challenge to keep moving, with purpose and compassion, toward a world where no one is left to struggle in the shadows of someone else's comfort. There is a profound stillness that settles over the city in the deepest hours of the night, a moment when the frenetic noise of the present briefly subsides, and the ancient enduring bones of London are left to rest. It is in this silence that the echoes of the past seem most vibrant. If you stand on the banks of the Thames, where the tides have risen and fallen for centuries, you can almost hear the rhythmic clatter of the horse-drawn carts, the muffled shouts of the vendors, and the soft collective sigh of a city that has survived more than it has ever revealed. These are the ghosts not of individuals, but of an era, the ghost of a struggle that defined the very foundations of the world we now inhabit. We have spent our journey peeling back the layers of time, seeking the truth behind the penny pie, and in doing so, we have discovered that the truth is not a fixed point, but a living, breathing continuity. The Victorian era was not merely a collection of dates and industrial milestones, it was a crucible of human experience, a time of radical transition where the sheer grit of the individual came into direct conflict with the impersonal power of the machine. The penny pie was the bridge between these two worlds, a humble, greasy object that carried the weight of 1,000 lives across the chasm of industrial change. As we prepare to step away from this narrative, let us pause to acknowledge the magnitude of the journey we have taken together. We have looked into the subterranean kitchens, felt the chill of the soot-laden fog, and walked the streets alongside those who built an empire with their calloused hands. We have learned that history is not just something to be observed from a distance, it is a weight to be carried, a light to be directed, and a mirror that reflects the best and the worst of our shared humanity. We have seen that the struggle for dignity is the most essential, persistent narrative of the human story. The city continues to grow, to modernize, and to obscure the footprints of those who came before. Glass towers now stand where the tenement buildings once crowded the sky, and the narrow, treacherous alleys have been widened into avenues of commerce. Yet the legacy of the past remains, embedded in the very structure of our society. It resides in the laws we enact, in the ethical standards we champion, and in the quiet, instinctive empathy we feel for those who labour in the shadows of our own time. We are the stewards of this legacy, the narrators of this ongoing story, And as we look ahead, we do so with a deeper understanding of the path that led us here, a path paved with sacrifice, resilience, and the enduring, unquenchable hunger for a better, more human world. As we approach the horizon of our exploration, there is one final lingering truth that demands to be spoken. History is never truly finished. It is a dialogue that we are constantly having with the generations that preceded us, a conversation that is punctuated not by the great, sweeping changes of regimes or economies, but by the quiet, granular choices we make every day. The story of the penny pie, with all its grime, its hidden ingredients, and its essential role in the life of the Victorian city, has served as a window not into a different world, but into the foundations of our own. We have seen how the struggle for survival in the basement kitchens and the soot-choked alleys was the precursor to the systems of care and conscience we value today. We have witnessed the evolution of the urban soul, from the raw, indifferent survivalism of the 19th century to the more refined, regulated, and socially conscious structures of the 21st. We have collectively climbed a long, difficult ladder. We have replaced the mystery of the penny pie with a hunger for transparency and ethics. We have moved from a society that viewed its labourers as disposable fuel to a society that, however imperfectly, strives to recognise the dignity of every individual. This is not a static achievement, it is a dynamic, ongoing process that requires our vigilance, our curiosity, and above all our ability to see the humanity in those who are often out of sight. Think of the people whose stories we have traced, the bakers, the street vendors, the labourers who stood in the rain, the reformers who eventually pushed for change. They were not merely historical characters, they were the architects of our current reality. Every time we enjoy a meal that we can trust, every time we benefit from a workplace safety standard, and every time we demand accountability from those in power, we are building upon the work they began in the dark. We are the inheritors of their perseverance, the narrators of their long silent story, and the guardians of the progress they so dearly fought for. As we stand at the close of this long narrative arc, let us carry the light of our inquiry into the future. Let us remember that the city is more than its architecture. It is a tapestry of human lives, woven together by the threads of shared necessity and the persistent, quiet hope for something better. The story of the penny pie may be a minor detail in the grand ledger of history, but it is a detail that speaks volumes about the enduring power of the human spirit. It reminds us that no life is too small to influence the course of history, and no struggle is too insignificant to leave a mark on the foundations of the future. We are and will always be a part of this unfolding narrative, a narrative that we continue to write day by day with every choice we make and every act of empathy we extend to the world around us. Let us pause for a moment in the silence of one such basement kitchen, long after the fires have been extinguished and the shadows have reclaimed the corners. If you could touch the objects left behind, the heavy, soot-blackened cast-iron pans, the dented copper pots that have survived decades of intense heat, the wooden spoons worn smooth by the frantic motion of countless shifts, you would feel the history of the labourers seep into your own skin. These are not merely tools, they are the artifacts of an existence defined by repetition and endurance. They were the extensions of the hands that held them, the instruments of a daily struggle that was as vital as it was ignored. Consider the worn handle of a dough scraper. How many thousands of times was it gripped by hands that were cold, chapped, and trembling with fatigue? Each nick and scratch on its surface tells a story of a moment of haste, a slip of concentration, or the sheer brute force required to keep the pace demanded by the city above. These objects are the silent repositories of the labourer's life. They were the only things that bore witness to the sighs, the muttered prayers, and the brief shared glances of solidarity between those who stood side by side in the stifling heat of the kitchen. They absorbed the steam, the grease, and the sweat, becoming saturated with the very essence of the work they facilitated. There is a haunting beauty in this debris of labour. In a world that prizes the new, the clean and the efficient, these weathered relics stand as a testament to the fact that progress is never a seamless transition. It is always a grinding, messy process that leaves behind the remnants of those who were sacrificed in its name. When we look at these tools today, displayed perhaps in a museum case or buried in the dark, forgotten foundations of a city building, we are confronted with a mirror of our own industrial inheritance. We realize that our modern comforts are predicated on the same relentless, repetitive labour. Even if the tools have changed, the locations have moved, and the visibility of the worker has been obscured by the complexities of the digital age. To hold such an object in one's imagination is to touch the past in a way that words alone cannot capture. It brings the reality of the penny pie era down to a human scale. It shifts the narrative from the abstract concepts of social change and economic movement to the visceral, tactile experience of a single person trying to make ends meet. It reminds us that behind every historical milestone lies a vast, uncounted sea of daily, ordinary lives, each defined by the same basic human needs, the same hopes, and the same quiet, unshakable resilience. We are, at our core, the descendants of these labourers, and these simple, worn-out tools are the keys to understanding the foundation of the world we call our own. If we ascend from the damp, grease-stained basement kitchens, we emerge into a world of blinding light and stifling opulence. Imagine the dining room of a grand manor house in Mayfair, late in the Victorian evening. Here the air does not smell of coal smoke and souring meat. It is thick with the scent of beeswax candles, fresh-cut hothouse flowers, and the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted game and imported wines. The contrast is not merely physical, it is a chasm that separates two different species of human experience. While the labourer in the East End was measuring his life in the density of gristle in a penny pie, the inhabitants of this room were measuring their status in the complexity of a multi-course banquet. The food served at these tables was designed to be in performance, a sensory declaration of dominance. Every dish was a testament to the power of the empire. Spices from the East, sugars from the Caribbean, and delicacies that required the labour of dozens of invisible hands to bring from the far corners of the globe to a porcelain plate. There was no mystery here, at least not in the sense of safety. The luxury was in the blatant, excessive display of provenance. The guests did not eat to survive, they ate to exhibit their place at the pinnacle of the social hierarchy. To dine in such a fashion was to participate in a ritual of exclusion, a demonstration that the resources of the world were theirs to command, consume, and discard as they pleased. Yet even in the heart of this gilded abundance there is a strange underlying anxiety. Observe the diners, the way they perform their own roles, the rigidity of their etiquette, the careful manoeuvring of social alliances. Their world, too, is a construct, just as artificial as the basement kitchen, albeit far more comfortable. They are trapped by the very systems they uphold. They are insulated from the reality of the city below, yet they are entirely dependent on the stability of that city to maintain their position. They are the beneficiaries of an industrial machine that they neither fully understand nor wish to see, living in a fragile bubble of refinement that rests precariously on the backs of the invisible workforce. This duality, the basement and the ballroom, is the true character of the Victorian era. It is the story of two Londons occupying the same geography, bound together by a system of production that benefited the one by consuming the other. Every penny pie baked in the dark was in a sense the foundation for the feast held in the light, and every feast held in the light was a silent, unacknowledged demand for the labour performed in the dark. We cannot understand the history of the penny pie without understanding the hunger of the ballroom, just as we cannot understand the evolution of our modern society without acknowledging that we too occupy a world built upon such vast, systemic disparities. The feast and the famine are not separate stories, they are two sides of the same complex coin. The true guardians of this disparity were the people who existed in the narrow corridors between the ballroom and the basement, the servants. A footman in his crisp livery, or a scullery maid with hands perpetually raw from harsh lye soap, lived a life of constant, silent translation. They were the bridge. They knew the exact weight of the silver platters used for the feast, and they knew the exact price of the scraps they would later scrape into the bin, a quantity that, if distributed differently, could have fed an entire row of slum tenements for a week. They were the only ones who saw both worlds with equal clarity, and in that perspective lay a quiet, dangerous wisdom. Consider the scullery maid tasked with cleaning the remnants of the banquet. She scraped the half-eaten delicacies, the roasted meats, the delicate pastries, the fruits that had barely been tasted into the disposal. She knew that just outside the manor walls there were children and labourers whose entire day's sustenance was the singular suspect penny pie. This was not just a matter of waste, it was a profound daily confrontation with the injustice of the system she served. To her, the contrast was not an abstract social theory, it was a physical sensation, the smell of fresh, wasted butter versus the smell of rotting cabbage from the street markets. Yet this awareness was a burden she had to carry in silence. Her survival depended on her ability to perform the role of the invisible servant, to be a ghost in the house that she maintained. She was the one who kept the ballroom polished and the basement kitchen functional, ensuring that the two worlds never truly collided. But within that silence, a form of resistance was forged. It was the resistance of the witness. By simply existing in the space between, by knowing the truth of both the abundance and the hunger, she became a carrier of the city's collective conscience. She was a reminder that every social structure, no matter how grand, rests on the unnoticed labour of those who know the truth behind the curtain. This perspective reveals the essential hypocrisy that defined the Victorian age. The feast was only possible because of the system that created the famine, and the system was only maintained because the people within it were conditioned to look away. But the servants could not look away. They saw the waste, they saw the hunger, and they felt the friction between the two. Their lives were the crucible where the contradictions of the empire were melted down and refined. They were the ones who ultimately understood that the penny pie and the banquet were not just different meals, they were different realities, held apart by a fragile social contract that was even then beginning to show its fractures. They were the first to know that something had to change. In the grey, uncertain light of 4 a.m., the London markets were the great equaliser. Here, the rigid hierarchies of the Victorian manor houses temporarily dissolved into the frantic, chaotic energy of commerce. You could see the kitchen maids of the wealthy, dressed in their plain, durable woolens, jostling for space alongside the dockworkers and the seamstresses. Both groups were seeking sustenance, but their destinations were worlds apart. The maid was selecting the finest cuts of beef and the most pristine seasonal vegetables for the evening's banquet, while the labourer was scanning the vendors for the cheapest, most filling option, often a day-old pie or a scrap of meat that the butcher was desperate to discard. In this damp, noisy atmosphere, the proximity was startling. A footman might accidentally brush shoulders with a man who lived in a basement room, not 10 minutes from his own employer's mansion. In that moment of collision, there was an unspoken, charged silence. Both knew the roles they played in the city's anatomy, yet in the cold, biting air of the market, the facade of the social contract felt thin. The food they were buying was a direct expression of their station. The quality of the meat, the freshness of the bread, and the mere presence of variety were the primary metrics of their existence. To hold a basket of premium produce while standing next to someone holding a single, greasy paper bag was to confront the sheer disparity of their lives. This was a space where the penny pie was not just a meal, but a symbol of necessity that cast a long, uncomfortable shadow over the luxury of the wealthy. The stall owners knew this, and they played their part, tailoring their wares to the two distinct tides of customers. There were the quality stalls, with their clean counters and neatly arranged goods, and the scrap stalls where the atmosphere was more desperate, more hurried, and more transactional. It was here that the reality of London's economy was laid bare. It wasn't found in the halls of Parliament or the boardrooms of the banks. It was found in the price per ounce of sustenance. For the keen observer, the market was a diagnostic tool for the health of the city. You could see the inflation, you could see the shortages, and you could see the widening gap between those who consumed for pleasure and those who consumed for survival. It was a place where the fragility of the entire urban structure became visible. If the labourers could no longer afford their pies, the city would stutter. If the wealthy could no longer obtain their luxuries, the facade of empire would crack. This marketplace, with all its grime and noise, was the pulsating heart of a society that was desperately trying to maintain its equilibrium, even as the tides of inequality threatened to pull it under. It was a place of fragile, temporary peace, but it was also a place where the seeds of the coming changes were being sown, one purchase at a time. Let us follow the life of a single, unremarkable penny pie, a small, dense parcel of dough and questionable protein, as it makes its way from the subterranean shadows into the cold light of the London streets. It began its existence in a cellar that saw no sunlight, a space where the air was permanently thick with the heavy metallic tang of rendered fat. Here the ingredients were processed with a brutal functional efficiency. Meat of obscure origin was chopped, seasoned heavily to mask the passage of time, and folded into a crust that was more structural than culinary. For the baker, this was not an act of creation, it was an act of industrial camouflage. The goal was volume, not taste, durability, not nourishment. Once baked, the pie was placed on a tray and loaded onto a cart, a rickety, iron-wheeled contraption that squeaked in a rhythmic, mournful tone as it was pushed through the damp, narrow alleys. The vendor, a man whose face was etched with the grime of the city and the exhaustion of his craft, navigated the labyrinth of the East End with the practised ease of a predator. He was not looking for customers in the traditional sense. He was looking for the subtle signs of survival-level hunger. He knew the shifts of the labourers, the rhythm of the docks, and the specific corners where a man with a penny in his pocket would be standing, desperate for the warmth that only a hot, greasy pastry could provide. When the exchange finally happened, it was a moment of stark, human necessity. A dock worker, shivering in the biting draught that blew off the Thames, handed over his copper penny. In return he received the pie, wrapped in a scrap of newsprint that stained his fingers with oil. This was not a meal to be savoured, it was a transaction of energy. He took a bite, the steam rising briefly into the freezing air, and for a few minutes he was shielded against the cold, his hunger dulled just enough to see him through the next hour of back-breaking work. In that brief communion, the pie fulfilled its ultimate purpose. It was not food in the refined sense, it was a tool, a necessary component of the machine that kept the labourer functioning. This simple exchange was the microscopic heartbeat of the empire. Millions of these transactions happened daily, unnoticed by the world of the ballroom, yet they were the very thing that allowed the world of the ballroom to exist. The dock worker, the street sweeper, the factory hand, they all operated on this caloric fuel, and the vendor, in his own way, was the unseen conductor of this massive, rhythmic, industrial energy. He moved from corner to corner, his cart a mobile source of warmth, his pies the currency of the underclass. He was the most important provider in the neighbourhood, even if the city at large would never have recognised his name. To understand the penny pie is to understand the literal, material cost of civilization. It was paid for, 1 penny at a time, by people whose only concern was surviving until the morning. The warmth of the penny pie was, at best, a temporary truce with the freezing reality of the London night. Once the greasy paper was discarded, and the last bite of dense, floury crust was swallowed, the dock worker was once again exposed to the brutal, relentless rhythm of his labour. The brief respite of the meal vanished as quickly as the steam rising from his lips, leaving behind only the cold reality of the task at hand. The docks were a landscape of shadows and sharp iron, where the sound of the Thames lapping against the rotting timbers served as a constant reminder of the chaos just beneath the surface of the working world. Every movement now required a renewed, deliberate effort. His muscles, long past the point of soreness and into the realm of dull, vibrating numbness, had to be forced into action. This was the true cost of the industrial age. It did not merely demand time, it demanded the physical integrity of the human body. He was no longer a person in the traditional sense, with a history, a family, or a future. He was a component, a gear that needed lubrication to continue turning. The penny pie had provided that lubrication, a minimal functional injection of calories meant to prevent the machine from grinding to a complete, final halt. There was no joy in this labour, only the rhythmic, mind-numbing repetition of unloading, lifting and dragging. Yet in this state of exhaustion there was a strange, grim clarity. When you have been stripped of everything but the immediate necessity of survival, you become acutely aware of your own endurance. You realize that you are capable of surviving conditions that would break someone who had not been tempered by the same fire. It was a cold, hard kind of pride, hidden deep beneath the surface of a man who looked like nothing more than a ragged silhouette against the greying dawn. This was the quiet, invisible martyrdom of the Victorian working class. They were the ones who carried the weight of the empire, yet they remained ghosts in its grand architecture. They lived and died in the gaps of the ledger, their contributions measured in tonnage and hours, never in individual dignity. As the night deepened and the cold intensified, the dockworker pressed on, his existence fueled by the memory of a penny's worth of comfort and the persistent, irrational hope that tomorrow might be different, even if he knew, in his gut, that the cycle would simply begin again the moment the sun touched the horizon. Miles away from the sodden docks, in a quiet, lamp-lit office in Whitehall, a very different kind of work was taking place. Here the air did not smell of coal smoke or rotting refuse. It smelled of dry parchment, sealing wax, and the faint sweet scent of tobacco. A committee of gentlemen tasked with the improvement of urban conditions sat hunched over stacks of reports and sprawling maps of the city. Their goal was clinical, not emotional, to identify the sources of inefficiency and instability in the lower districts. To them, the labouring class was not a collection of individuals with names and sorrows. They were data points in a grand, administrative puzzle. They discussed the sanitary crisis with a detachment that was both professional and chilling. They spoke of the penny pie trade as a public health hazard, analysing the mortality rates of certain streets with the same cold precision one might use to calculate the failure rate of a machine. They were, in their own minds, the architects of progress, men who would bring order to the chaos of the East End, but as they pored over their maps, drawing red lines around the districts where the penny pie vendors thrived, they lacked any true understanding of the reality behind the numbers. They had never tasted the dough, they had never shivered in the draught of the docks, and they had never felt the desperation that made a penny pie a necessity rather than a choice. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.